Here comes the expert.
I'm sorry, sir. Was it your turn to talk or was it mine?
Oh, God. I hope this is going to be new information that you're not going to repeat yourself. Okay, that's it. You've got your 4 minutes.
Mayor, move to take a recess.
Do you want to be escorted out
You're
of here?
violating my First Amendment rights.
Talking.
You are violating my First Amendment rights.
That's your opinion.
It's not a matter of opinion.
Do you want to be escorted out?
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The Grand Failure Beyond the Streets.
Hello, and welcome back to the Grand Failure Beyond the Streets podcast. If this is your first time ever tuning in, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. This episode is a very special episode indeed, as it is the 12th episode of this show and the season 1 finale, if you can believe that. My name is Rebekah Massie, and I'm the host of the Grand Failure podcast. Today's recording is also special and near and dear to my heart, as it marks the first episode that I'm going to be recording since before the events of August 20th, 2024, a breaking of the silence, if you will. Now, despite what you may be thinking, no, this will not be an episode about my experience, quote, going viral, unquote. This will, however, be the first time I am speaking publicly on any of my platforms or social media accounts for any specific or significant amount of time. That has not been something along the lines of simply firing off a few late night tweets, an interview with a member of the news media, or even some sort of official statement that's been crafted with the help of my lawyers, etc. Before I go any further, let me provide a tiny bit of recap and context that I can given the circumstances. For those who are perhaps joining me for the first time here, or those who maybe haven't seen the news about me, let me explain. Or I guess pointing you in the right direction would be a better way to describe this. I can confirm that there are some pending legal procedures and cases. Due to these pending legal procedures and cases and even federal litigation, I cannot officially comment or discuss what happened on August 20th, 2024. What I can do is, as I usually do with these podcast episodes, on my website, thegrandfailure.org, that's thegrandfailure.org, I can provide the links to the news stories, press releases, video footage, and so forth that has come forward on all of this. And that way you can take a look, get yourself caught up to speed, and understand where things have been at and what I've been dealing with. Since the events of that night, I have been shoved into a spotlight that truthfully I didn't ever expect, nor was I prepared for, or could I have ever been prepared for. In all honesty, if you had asked me what was going to happen, never in a million years would I have guessed that my advocacy efforts, my work to expose corruption, or hell, even hosting this podcast would ever wind up making a name for myself or gaining any sort of notoriety. I figured that, if anything, my name would be secondary to the message that I was putting out there. I wanted to help people, specifically people in my local city of Surprise, Arizona, and I wanted to help them in becoming more aware about what is and what has been happening that impacts our daily lives, and really why sometimes the problems or the issues that we're facing are actually more along the lines of symptoms of a disease. The disease, or really sometimes it can feel more like a cancer at times really, is government bureaucracy. And I'm sorry to say this, but the prognosis is not good. It's not terminal by any means, but it's definitely not looking good, especially if we, as a collective society, continue to stand idly by and do nothing. Now, you may be wondering exactly what I mean here by a cancerous government. Let me explain. Before I go further, I do strongly encourage you to listen to the rest of season 1, read the information on what happened back on August the 20th that led me here. That is, of course, if and when you have the time to do so. Safe to say for now, though, I will go ahead and continue in explaining on just how I feel this all links together. When I started this journey, I initially intended this podcast to be focused on the issues of the roadways, traffic issues, and infrastructure, or really lack thereof, in the northwest part of Surprise. To be more specific, the northern part of District 1, which is the district that I reside in, the district that has these traffic problems, and District 1 is essentially how the city has divided up all of us for the purpose of council seats, etc. What I quickly uncovered is that despite the problem being about roads and access points, overzealous development, etc., really what it all boiled down to was the government halting progress on any sort of resolution in our area's infrastructure crisis. This epiphany came about to me by realizing that the government was creating problems that we as private citizens are now essentially forced to rely on them to solve. And this came about roughly around the time our local elections were starting to pick up speed, start that election season, if you will. And what I mean by that is this was earlier in the spring, late winter timeframe when you had candidates starting to file statements of interest, going around collecting signatures on their nomination petitions, and overall, again, just gearing up for the local elections that were set to take place on July 30th, 2024, and that did take place on July 30th. Now, this epiphany caused me to shift my thought process. And in shifting my thought process on ways to solve for the traffic and public safety issues, it didn't quite happen overnight, but it did happen rather quickly, especially if I consider that perhaps now I've done a bit more self-reflecting. I've been able to Monday morning quarterback things a little bit more. Hindsight's 2020, all of that, right? And I've come to realize that me personally, I may not have done that great of a job at explaining my thought processes to you and may not have helped you guys sort of tag along with me on this journey versus simply telling you what conclusions I came to and what those were. And for that, I do apologize. I hope that you can forgive me. You see, this is my first podcast and really my first shake at any sort of, I guess, for lack of a better word, content creation, if we can even call it that. I honestly have no idea what I'm doing. I've been learning as I go. And for those of you who have stuck around since the beginning and have seen a bit more into what I'm talking about here and what I've been speaking about all along, I truly thank you. For those who have just started paying attention in light of recent circumstances, I thank you too. And hopefully you'll be able to see how I got from point A to point B and so forth. And those of you who have provided feedback, truly without the feedback I've received from some of you, I honestly don't know if I would have even had the stomach to continue, much less write up my script for this episode, where hopefully you'll find that this sort of brings and meshes all of my prior episodes together. You see, my mindset shifting really began when I realized just how many little and potentially seemingly innocuous, insignificant, or seemingly unrelated items that happen in our city played into a much deeper issue. And what I mean by that is look at things like the budget differences for the city of Surprise between fiscal year 2024 and fiscal year 2025. Look at the way the city reviewed and adjusted the development impact fees a few months ago. Look at how the city played the budgetary shortfall that was created by a move at the Arizona State Legislature to remove rental property taxes. And when I say small budgetary shortfall, for the average person, it's a lot of money, but for a city that, like Surprise, for instance, has a fiscal year 2025 budget of $1 billion. Yes, that's billion with a B. $14.1 million is not a huge amount to try and figure out to come up with the difference, right? What the city wound up doing was increasing the sales tax to cover that shortfall. So let that sink in for a moment. And now what I want you to do is scale that up to what goes on in our political environments at the state level. And that includes state Senate races. It includes the races for the state house, even all of these ballot propositions, your corporation commission races, school board races, judge retentions, etc. The list goes on and on and on. And if you take that scale, right, from the city level to the state level, and then scale it all the way up to a national level with our federal congressional races, forget about it. You're going to get lost really, really quickly. And honestly, I know the hot button topic this year is the presidential election, but I honestly do not even want to get into the presidential race here at all. That'll be a conversation for another time and another day. And even if you may not see the correlations yet or see how these all connect to one another and intertwine, I do. So do others in your circle, probably. And so do other people around your city, other people around your state, and certainly other people all around our country. And to be clear, I don't mean that this is all some sort of giant conspiracy theory or anything along those lines, though, and I say this in jest here a little bit, but at times it does kind of feel like I need to go to my cupboard, take a bit of tinfoil out, shape it into a hat, but that's not my point here, right? The point is, people need to be paying attention. You need to be paying more attention. And you, me, and everybody else need to start taking note of what's going on. Once you've opened your eyes to what the government is doing, what their agendas are, how these things often connect together, etc., that's really when the real work begins. Because not only do you, as an individual, need to take the time to research these sorts of things, but you, as an individual, need to figure out how this could and will impact your life and the life that you share with your friends, your family, and your other loved ones. And I hate to tell you this, but you're also going to find that you have some homework to do. And what I mean is that it might be a little bit of a tough job to do. It's going to take some research on your part. You're going to need to separate fact from fiction. You're going to need to separate distraction from what is, we'll say, hiding behind the curtain. You're going to need to figure out what is at risk. You'll probably even need to do like a risk assessment or a SWOT analysis. And if you don't know what a SWOT analysis is, well, first off, SWOT is an acronym, and that's spelled SWOT, not SWAT, like a SWAT team for starters. And what a SWOT analysis is in that acronym is the S stands for strengths, the W for weaknesses, the O for opportunities, and the T for threats. And what you do is you figure out an issue at hand, right? And you outline kind of like a pros and cons column, but you're going to say, okay, here's the strengths of this ballot proposition, for instance. Here's the weakness or the weaknesses if this were to pass or if it weren't to pass, right? What are the opportunities? Okay. What does this still leave on the table? What does this potentially open up the possibilities for? And then T for threats. Is passing this ballot proposition, for instance, going to make it harder for candidates to get on the ballot, for instance? Or is this going to make it harder for a healthcare decision? Is this going to make it harder for roads to be built in the state? But you can take any ballot proposition or any item on the Arizona ballot, especially within Maricopa County with everything we have on there, and really apply this process to any of it. And before you ask, I'm not going to do any of this homework for you, at least not now. And at this time, I'm not even going to share my thoughts or my analyses with you. And that's on purpose, right? I'm doing this with a lot of thought behind it. And to be clear, this is not because I don't want to share. By all means, if and when I'm able to, I'm always happy to discuss or debate policy, so long as the conversation is civil and constructive. I love hearing different points of view. And I love hearing your thought process as to how you came to X conclusion. We don't have to agree, but we do need to remain respectful and we do need to remain constructive when we're having these types of conversations. The reason I'm not going to share any of my thoughts today is because, truthfully, I want you to think for yourself. And that's because too often, between the mainstream media, between all of our social media platforms, politicians themselves, your friends, your family, your coworkers, your neighborhood groups, and really whoever else you get your information from, they all wind up essentially being attempts to spoon feed you the information that the speaker wants you to believe or understand or take away. And so when you have these attempts to spoon feed the masses or the public, as it were, myself and you included in this, what happens is a couple of different things. Now, I've talked a bit about my political views and my affiliations before. In case you may not recall, I am a libertarian, technically a lowercase l libertarian, but I am also a member of the LP National organization, which would mean I'm a capital L libertarian as well. And because I'm a member of National, I am also a member of the state and county affiliates where I reside. So respectfully, that would be the Arizona Libertarian Party and the Maricopa County Libertarian Party affiliates. Now, I'm not going to dive into the difference on what it means between the two of a lowercase l and a capital L libertarian, but I will say this. If nothing else, the way libertarianism works and at its core is that libertarianism believes in the individual over the collective, which means that most, if not all, believe that you, as the individual, govern best since you know exactly what your needs are in life or what your family's needs are. Libertarianism also, with respect to individualism, places an extremely high value on independent thinking, critical thinking, and ideally, the use of the Socratic method to debate, come to your conclusions, support your positions, etc. And it's because of those ideals, right, that I want you on your own as an individual to think. I want you to research and I want you to figure out your stances on the issues. And most importantly, above all else, I want you to use your voice. Before I move on with how you should work to ensure that your voice is heard, I want to talk for a moment about the silence. If these last several weeks have taught me anything, it's that silence can absolutely be deafening. And I don't just mean that it's quiet and you don't hear other people speaking. I don't even mean that it's so quiet that if you're sitting outside in the dark late in the evening that you can hear the faint noises of nature and so forth. I mean that the silence is so loud, it hurts. Those of you who have tinnitus know what I mean. It's that deafening, but somehow quiet ringing in your eardrums that renders all outside noise null and void. For those of you who have ever been to the range, it's almost like if someone's fired a gun in close proximity to your ear, and all you can hear is just that weird ringing echo of the gunshot. And it kind of almost feels like pressure in your ear. Or for those of you who maybe don't have experience with firearms and have seen movies, right? I think all of us have seen a movie at least once in our life, right? It's like that ringing that you see the main character experience when something like a bomb or other type of explosion goes off. And it's very quiet and you just sort of hear that ringing. And then usually this takes place right before the main character jumps in and saves the day. Except for in this case, there is no main character. There is no saving the day. There's just nothing but you and the silence. Now, my sincerest apologies if you felt that that analogy or that description was a bit dark.
Oh, don't be so dramatic.
But it's true. Silence can be deafening, and I don't mean just literally. I mean figuratively as well. There are a lot of examples, many even from this year, where we don't even necessarily experience total and complete deafening silence, but instead, we experience a world of nothing but chaotic chatter, and that chatter becomes a part of the general buzz or noise that fades and filters into the background. And we do this essentially because our brains decide that it's all chatter and it means nothing. So the question then becomes, when this happens, how do we break the silence? And more importantly, how do you break through the silence and raise your voice? When it comes to rising to the occasion, meaning standing up and speaking out, sometimes all it takes is one or two individuals to say something or do something that generates an entire movement. And we can see this demonstrated in all sorts of stories and all sorts of events throughout history. For instance, think about the historical figures like Rosa Parks and her decision to not move and give up her seat on the bus that day. Think about someone like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. We could go back to the founding fathers. One that comes to mind is Thomas Jefferson and his absolute commitment to championing democracy and liberty. We could look at people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton with their work in the women's suffrage movement. And we could even look into a bit more of a recent example if we look to the Supreme Court, specifically Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And RBG often was attributed to her bravery to state often that she dissents. Personally, I don't agree with Justice Ginsburg on absolutely everything that she did or every opinion that she had, but I feel like objectively, we would be lying to ourselves if we didn't take a look and realize that her loss is still felt on the Supreme Court today. And it cannot be argued that those notorious statements of dissent won't live on in spirit by those who understand just how great of an impact that she had while serving our nation. And of course, this list is not all inclusive, nor is this drawing any comparisons between these people specifically, myself, or anybody else for that matter, right? But what I bring these up for is to illustrate the point, and that is we could continue to list important advocates, activists, and other political figures until we're blue in the face from lack of oxygen. But the point here is that really, sometimes all it takes is one thing, one person, one movement, or one initiative to start spinning the wheels of change towards progress. One single change in direction can turn the winds in a different direction and inspire progress. And so with that, I have just one question for you. What will you do to inspire change? As I wrap up this episode, I want to leave you with a few words of recommendation as you decide your fate, and with ballots being cast, the fate of our city, the fate of our state, and ultimately the fate of our country. Figure out your stances, do your own research, surround yourself with allies. And by allies, I mean not just people who agree with everything that you do and hold the same opinions. All that's going to do is create an echo chamber. I want you to find people who challenge your ways of thinking. Find people that you can trust. Work together to advance liberty on the issues that you do agree on. Party affiliation be damned. It doesn't matter. Recognize that your voice has power. Understand that more voices behind an issue amplifies your reach. Realize and believe that you can make a difference in your local communities. Even if it's simply casting your ballot, it makes a difference. And don't ever let the silence win. When I say that, this kind of reminds me of a song lyric by a mid to late 2000s emo or pop punk band named Mayday Parade. They're in the same sort of vein as Fall Out Boy, Panic at the Disco, etc. The song in and of itself, much like most songs by these types of bands in the time that this came out, is more of a hopeless romantic breakup song of sorts, but I feel like where our political environment is today, the chorus is strangely applicable. We're promised the world by just about every political candidate, only for things to seemingly really never change much. And because we feel that things never change, it's really easy to get caught up in the thought of, does it even matter if I speak up? Does it even matter if I vote? I'll share these lyrics with you now. They go like this. And I'll be here by the ocean, just waiting for proof that there's sunsets and silhouette dreams. All my sandcastles fall like the ashes of cigarettes, and every wave drags me to sea. I could stand here for hours just to ask God the question, is everyone here make-believe? With a tear in his voice, he says, son, that's the question. Does this deafening silence mean nothing to no one but me? I know I'm not the only one out there that really feels at times that the deafening silence is creeping in. And for those who feel it too, I challenge you. Find your people. Figure out what matters most. Focus on creating change. And whatever you do not go into this world alone. Form a network, a coalition, a pack, an organization, or heck, even just a group of like-minded neighbors who want to see your local area thrive. Do it. It might never be easy, but it surely is going to be better when you're working together. You know, what's that saying? Many hands make light work and so forth. And remember, you will face tough times, but the tough times are far easier to get through when you have a support system. And I'll leave you with this as far as making a difference, getting through the tough times, and standing together. As George R.R. Martin, who writes Game of Thrones, specifically, as the characters are discussing the long years of winter coming, essentially an impending doom, there's this quote in the book that always rings out in my mind, and it goes like this. When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
You're listening to The Grand Failure, Beyond the Streets, a podcast about the ongoing public safety crisis in Surprise, Arizona.
The Grand Failure podcast is hosted, edited, and produced by Rebekah Massie. Jonathan Perry is credited with the voiceover and announcement work. I'd like to thank Spotify for podcasters as the hosting and distribution platform, and the folks over at Audacity with the open source software that made the production and editing of this podcast possible. Any graphics, logos, or artwork used to promote or identify the podcast was created by Rebekah Massie using the Canvas software. Sound effects, music, and more are provided courtesy of freesound.org, a website that offers royalty-free Community Commons licenses for a variety of sound bites, songs, and effects. Any sources, news articles, or other information will be linked on the webpage dedicated to the Grand Failure podcast on thegrandfailure.org. That's thegrandfailure.org. I'd also like to thank the local political action committee in the area, or PAC, by the name of Voice of Surprise, for their partnership and efforts on my podcast, as well as give a quick shout out and thank you to my husband, Brian Massie, who has graciously put up with my work on this endeavor. Thank you all for your time and for all of the podcast credits, details, and information. Once again, they can be found on the website, thegrandfailure.org.